Jesus told a parable in Matthew 13. He's telling a lot of parables about agriculture. This one is about plants and weeds. And he says the kingdom of God is like a plant trying to grow, trying to spread, flourish, bear fruit. But there's a lot of weeds out there working against it. And his parable is to encourage his followers to see that the work they are doing for God's kingdom, to spread the beloved community of Jesus, is not in vain. It might seem like the weeds are winning, but keep at it. Keep working. Keep loving. Keep forgiving. Keep helping, because the kingdom of God is thriving in the midst of these weeds, and we got to make sure we continue to help it to grow. In this parable, I think Jesus also wants us to see ourselves as those seeds, and it's not a hard leap to make to see he's talking about us, and he sees us as these plants, and he knows the kind of weeds that we are facing, and he wants us to go through life knowing there are just always going to be weeds. You just never have much of a weed-free time in life. So expect it. Don't be surprised. Don't complain and feel like it's unfair. Just know Jesus says this is a part of what it means to follow him. There's always going to be weeds. We need a strategy for how to deal with them. And so there is an invitation that he extends to us to sit back, maybe take a deep breath. Think about the weeds in your life, the things that are trying to choke you and cut you off from joy, cut you off from the fullness of life. What are some of the weeds you're facing this morning, right now? What are the weeds that are trying to pull you down and cut you off from the light and keep you from bearing fruit, keep you from being the beautiful plant that God has made you to be? Almost all of us, I would guess, immediately think of the weeds of living in a pandemic. I still remember back in March when this first started, and so many of us were making plans like, well, maybe these next couple weeks we're just going to have to adapt until we get this thing under control. We're now at the end of July, and we're doing worse than we've ever done. Higher daily totals, and the thing just is spreading, and we're going to be in this situation for a long time. It is depressing. And let's be honest, it's a weed. The more we're in this, the more these weeds are growing up around us, and they're just seeking to cut us off and pull us down. Weeds. Our life circumstance might be a weed. Problems with our health, problems with our family, problems with our job. These things can be weeds, and they can just pull us down and choke us out of experiencing the fullness of life that Jesus is calling us to. How about you? You're wrestling with some of those weeds, and are they getting pretty tall and pretty strong? Some of us, we think about weeds in our life, the first thing that comes to mind might be some other people. Let's be honest. All of us have some people in life who just can feel like they are too negative, too critical, too needy, sucking the nutrients out of us, pulling us down, making us feel discouraged, even hopeless. Other people sometimes can feel like weeds. Some of us, if we're honest, would say the weeds aren't out there. The weeds are right in here. The things we say to ourselves, the things that we whisper into our own ears, these feelings of disappointment in ourselves, being too self-critical, too self-negative, too harsh on ourselves, spending too much time comparing ourselves with others. Weeds, they just can choke us and keep us from becoming these sort of full blossoming plants Jesus talks about in the parable. Jesus tells this story so his followers then and now can say, I am a plant, but I am no small plant. I'm greater than the weeds that are around me. I'm stronger than the weeds that are around me. And Jesus calls me to rise in the midst of these weeds, to rise above them like a sunflower, tall and strong and shining in the light and revealing beauty to others. That's what this parable is about. Jesus is inviting us to feel hopeful and encouraged and confident, acknowledging the weeds in our lives. Somehow, as I was thinking of this parable, what came to my mind was a poem that I love, many of you love. It is one of the great poems by one of our great poets. The poem is Still I Rise, the author Maya Angelou, and it was read beautifully this morning by the Black young women and adult women in our church, and what a blessing that was. Still I Rise, Maya Angelou. Her story is well known. She's written her autobiography over the course of a number of different volumes, along with poems and other writings. Her great-grandmother was a slave. Her great-grandmother was raped by her white slave owner. Her great-grandmother became pregnant through that rape, and the child that was born became Maya Angelou's grandmother. Maya was born in St. Louis, Missouri. At age 4, her parents, after a terrible marriage, split, and she was sent not to live with either parent, but with the other grandmother down in Arkansas. Lived there for 4 years. Her father reappeared and very suddenly and unexpectedly yanked her back up to St. Louis to live with her mother. At age 8, Maya Angelou was sexually abused and raped by her mother's boyfriend. She told her brother that this has happened. Her brother told her family. Family told the judge. And this rapist in the household was taken to court, charged with raping a child, sentenced to 1 day in jail. 4 days after he was released, Maya's family murdered him. This was all by the age of 8. Maya Angelou, in talking about that event, said these words. She said, I thought my voice killed him. She named the man to her brother. I thought my voice killed him. I killed that man because I told his name, and I thought I would never speak again because my voice would kill someone. Maya Angelou became selectively mute, did not speak for 5 years. During that time, she read a lot and became a great lover of literature. That prompted her to start writing. She started writing, and her writing skills developed, and she started in this new path. At age 17, she bore a son. She married a man who was white, and that was the beginning of no end of difficulties and challenges as people were unaccepting of an interracial marriage. They divorced, and over the course of the coming years, she became a laborer, a dancer, a sex worker, an autobiographical writer, a poet, a teacher, and an activist. In 1978, she wrote a poem which seemed to sum up so many of these themes of her life, so many of these challenges, so many of these difficulties, so many of these things that were beating her down and working against her. And it is a poem that is a great testimony not only to her life, but to the challenges faced by so many women of African descent. Still I Rise. In that poem, she just lists so many of the weeds in her life that tried to come up and pull her down, tried to wrap themselves around her and choke her and make her life less than it should be. But in her poem, she writes, no matter how many weeds there were, still I rise. No matter how many obstacles, still I rise. No matter how many problems, still I rise. No matter how many times she was a victim, still I rise above them. It may take a long time to rise above the weeds in one's life, to rise above the problems, to rise above proudly, and to say the weeds have not overcome me. Sometimes it takes more than a lifetime. But the downtrodden are always being called to find the strength to rise. I can't help but think these days about the indigenous people of this country, indigenous people of this continent. 500 years ago, Christopher Columbus, he found his way over to the Americas. It was a long journey. No one is discrediting how hard that journey was. But after he got here, we need to be honest about the life that he lived, governing on the island of Hispaniola, Haiti, Dominican Republic, that island. He came to the conclusion there was gold there, and so he settled in, set up shop, enslaved the people of the New World. This wasn't Plymouth Rock. This wasn't any kind of a partnership. This was enslavement. And he committed atrocities in the name of taking gold. People were made into slaves and sent into the gold mines, and if they came back and they didn't have enough gold, he cut their hands off. People who had any kind of a problem or seemed in any way to be trouble, he dismembered them, tortured them, had his men use them for sword practice, killed them. He was the author of an early genocide that we should know about. And I invite you, if you haven't read some of that history, to read it now. Indigenous Americans have been in these weeds for 500 years, telling this story, and now, finally, it seems, being heard. Let's be honest. I mean, this is more than statues, but statues are a part of it. The Hitler statues came down. The Stalin statues came down. I'm very grateful that Columbus statues are coming down. And we're hearing this story with clarity and honesty, as painful as it is to hear. On this issue, I know a lot of indigenous folks who have just suffered thinking we celebrate someone who perpetrated genocide. And these days, they too can rise. Well, let's shift back to you and me. How about you? Jesus is saying to you today, you too can rise. What are the weeds that you're wrestling with? What is it that's choking you? What is it that's pulling you down? What is it that's cutting you off from being this beautiful, flourishing plant that Jesus calls you to be and do? Is there something on the outside, something in your life circumstances? You can rise above that. Is it other people in your life? They're not going away. So we're called to find ways to live in the midst of these relationships so that we can rise. What are the weeds? Is it the voices inside your head that you say to yourself? And Jesus says, let's rise above those voices. Let's rise above those fears, those worries, those self-criticisms. Let's rise above all of that. The message he wants us to leave with is a simple one. When we go through life walking with Jesus, with him at our side, with him as our friend, with him as the foundation upon which we have built our lives, we are bigger than the weeds. We are stronger than the weeds. And the weeds will not stop us. Jesus was dead. And yet he declared, I'll rise. Maya Angelou suffered greatly and yet declared, I'll rise. So many people facing so many hardships, in the midst of them have declared, I'll rise. Let's you and I do the same. There is so much beauty within you, like a beautiful flower. There is so much fruit in you still waiting to be born. And so I hope you can say with Jesus, so many of his followers over 2,000 years, I hope you can say in your heart, in spite of the weeds in my life, I'll rise. I'll rise. I'll rise, rise, rise.